Now we come to the next topic, that is animal tissues. Animal tissues, if you look at the animal body is also made up of different types of cells. For example, if you take the human body is made up of about 210 different types of cells. Just think of yourself. If you take the outermost covering of our body, it is the skin. And if you look at the skin closely, there are different types of cells. The normal skin is made up of a certain type of cell, whereas your hair that is also on the skin, that is of different type of cells. Then the nails are of different types of cells. So likewise, if you look at your full body, it is made up of many different types of cells. So there are about 210 different types of cells. So remember this, there are about 210 different types of cells in the human body. And as you already know, a group of cells which are similar in nature combine together and form the tissues. What are tissues? There are a group of cells with common origin to perform a specific function in the multicellular animal body. So here again you have to remember these two terms, common origin and to perform a specific function. So in our body and the body of other multicellular organisms, there are different types of tissues that perform different functions. If we look at our body, there are 4 main types of tissues. Main types of animal tissues are, one is the epithelial tissue. First one, epithelial tissue. You can remember this tissue. Epi means out. So the tissue that covers the outer surfaces of the body as well as the organs are epithelial tissues. Then we have the different types of connective tissues. Tissues that connect different parts of the body. So that is the second type, connective tissue. Third type of tissue that helps us in our movement as well as locomotion. Those are the muscle tissues. Many different types of movements. Muscle tissue. And the fourth type of tissue is there to coordinate and control the functions of all these different tissues. That is the nervous tissue. So the fourth type is nervous tissue. Epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue and nervous tissue. Now let us observe these tissues in a human body. Different tissues in human body. So here they have shown some of the tissues that are present. The first one shown here is the connective tissue. From this part, if you take the bones or the blood tissue, they all come under connective tissue. And again, the bone tissue is also shown to you all. In all different parts of our body, there is bones. So the bone is made up of bone tissues. Epithelial tissue, the outermost layer of our body, that is the skin or epidermis of the skin, is made up of epithelial tissue. On this side, you can see the brain here, brain of a person. that is made up of nervous tissues. Then we have the heart, which is part of the circulatory system. This pumps blood, and that is made up of cardiac muscle tissue. Then here, when we come to this part of the body, the abdomen, you can see part of the digestive system. In that, we can find the smooth muscle tissue. So, from this diagram itself, you can understand that different parts of our body is made up of different types of tissues. And under different types of tissues, there are many different types of cells. So, our full body, which functions as one organism, is made up of many different types of cells, which again form many different types of tissues. With that introduction, now we will move on to the first type of tissue, that is the epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue. This is the tissue that lines up the free surfaces, internal and external, of the vertebrate body. So, here you have to remember, students, lines up the free surfaces. So, if we take the outermost surface of our body, that is the skin. So, the epidermis of the skin is made up of epithelial tissue. That is the external surface. And we saw the intestine. Intestine, as you all know, is a tubular structure. Starting from the mouth to the anus is the digestive system. That is a tubular structure. There is an internal space. So, there is an internal surface. So, the lining of the digestive system, that is the internal surface, is also by the epithelial tissue. So, here you have to remember the free surfaces, both external and internal, are covered by the epithelial tissue. And we mainly say it is the vertebrate body. You all know the advanced animals come under the group vertebrates, all the animals that possess the vertebral column. So, man is a vertebrate, and there are many other animals that are vertebrates. All of our body has this epithelial tissue. Some of them are composed of single layer of cells and the others with several cell layers. Now, if you take a capillary tube, the capillary, that is the smallest and thinnest type of blood vessels that are present in our body. And these capillaries are lined by one layer of epithelial tissue. So, here single layer. But if we take the skin, that is made up of many layers of epithelial tissue. So, it can be a single layer or several layers. Now, let us look at the epithelial tissue in a diagrammatic form. A special feature of this tissue is that there is this membrane, which is called the basement membrane, or can be called the basal membrane. Always the layers of epithelial tissue are arranged on this basement membrane. That is a specific feature of epithelial tissue. And then, if you look at the cells, they can be of different types. They can be very flat cells like this, or they can be a cube-like structure like this, or they can have a long, tall structure like that. So, the shape of the cells in the epithelial tissue can be different, but all of them are arranged on a basement membrane, and there is no intercellular space. All the cells are tightly packed without a space between them. So here you can see tightly packed cells. And in the middle of the cell, you can see a very distinct nucleus. Irrespective of the shape of the cell, all the cells will have a nucleus. So those are the features of epithelial tissue. If we look at it again, the cells are placed on a basement membrane. The cells are tightly packed. That means there is no intercellular space. And the most important thing or another important feature is that there is enough nerve supply, but there is no blood supply. So a nerve supply is present, but there is no blood supply. So if you pinch yourself, you can feel the pain. That is because there is nerve supply. But if there is just a rubbing of the tissue, only the outermost layer is removed, you won't see blood coming because there is no blood supply. But if you get a cut, if you get a wound, that is not only the epithelial tissue, but it is the muscles as well. So the outermost layer, which is made up of epithelial tissue, does not have blood supply. So these are the features that you have to remember. And as I said before, the cells can be of different shapes. So the epithelial tissue is classified according to the shape of the cell and the number of cell layers. So those are the ways in which the epithelial tissue is classified. So based on the shape as well as whether they are single layered or multi-layered. We will try to observe the features of epithelial tissue using permanent slides. Okay students, now we are going to observe the epithelial tissue using a permanent slide. So you all know the features of epithelial tissue. I will get the permanent slide for the epithelium. Okay, so this is a permanent slide for the epithelial tissue. Before placing the slide, I will put it to low power. Now the slide is in position on the stage and I'll move it so that there is enough light falling on the specimen and the specimen is in place and it is low power, so we can observe it under the low power. When we do a little bit of adjustment, now you can see the epithelial tissue, how the tissue is in place. Okay students, so you have observed how epithelial tissue looks like and you can understand the features of the epithelial tissue by looking at the slide. Now we will discuss the locations of epithelial tissue, where these tissues are present. Several locations of epithelial tissues are given below. We will look at the tissues one by one. If you take the blood capillaries, I discussed this with you all students. They are the smallest blood vessels present and the walls of these capillaries are made up of epithelial tissue. So the first location is the wall of blood capillaries. The next location is the thyroid gland. This is an endocrine gland. a gland that produces thyroxine hormone. You all are familiar with thyroxine hormone, and this thyroid gland is lined up with epithelial tissue. So the second location is thyroid gland. Then if we take the respiration process, you all know it's always good to respire or inhale through your nose, not the mouth. Why is that? Because there are special adaptations in the nasal cavity that prevents dust particles and microorganisms from entering our respiratory tract. So this nasal cavity is lined up with epithelial tissue. So there we find epithelial tissue, nasal cavity. Then if we take the excretory system of our body, a part of the excretory system is the urinary bladder, where urine gets temporarily stored. This urinary bladder is lined up with epithelial tissue. So the next one is urinary bladder. And finally, the example that we talked about before, the skin that surrounds our body. The epidermis, outer layer of the skin, is made up of several layers of epithelial cells. So that is a good example of epithelial tissue. The epidermis of the skin. Skin epidermis is made up of epithelial tissues. Wall of blood capillaries, thyroid gland, nasal cavity, urinary bladder, and the epidermis of the skin are all lined up of epithelial tissue. Now let's discuss the functions of epithelial tissue. Functions of epithelial tissue. Lining up of free surfaces and protection. So we have already discussed this. Epithelial tissue lines up the free internal and external surface of organs as well as the body. So by doing that, it provides protection to the organism as well as the organs. Protects the internal organs from pressure, friction and microbes. So as you can see, when we touch or feel the hand, or when we walk, if we rub ourselves against a wall or an object, the internal parts, that is the muscle, the blood vessels, all these are protected from that particular pressure. Friction, the same thing. When your hand or something gets rubbed against a wall, the skin protects the internal organs from friction and also from pathogens, microbes, microorganisms that cause diseases are pathogens. So skin prevents the entering of these pathogens into our body to its maximum level. So therefore, we get protection from pressure, friction and microbes. The next function, absorptive function. The epithelium of digestive tract absorbs digestive end products. As I explained before, our digestive tract is a tubular structure. So the inner lining, the inner surface of this tubular structure is lined up with epithelial tissue. and inside the digestive system, food is broken down and the end product is absorbed by the body into the bloodstream. So there, the absorbing function is done by the epithelial tissue. So then the epithelial tissue will have a certain adaptation. As we discussed before, there are different types of epithelial tissue based on shape as well as the number of layers. So here, based on the different functions, there will be different shapes and different adaptations in these epithelium. The next function, perception of stimuli. Perception means receiving the different types of stimuli. You all know skin is an organ that receives stimuli. It's a sensory organ. There are different types of stimuli that can be received by the skin. For example, we can feel a touch, we can feel pressure, we can feel pain, we can feel the temperature change, that is the heat and the cold nature of environment. So all these are different senses. Similarly, if you take your tongue, that is lined up of epithelium. It can sense taste, different types of taste. The nasal cavity has epithelium that can sense or perceive smell. So likewise, there are linings in different sensory organ. The lining is epithelial tissue and that can receive stimuli, perception of stimuli. The epithelium of tongue and nose detects taste and smell senses. Secretory function. We discussed that the thyroid gland is lined up with epithelial tissue. Secretion of mucus by the lining of epithelium of respiratory tract. This is another example where mucus is secreted. Now, if you take the respiratory system, inside the nasal cavity as well as within the system, there is mucus, a substance that is needed to keep the respiratory tract moist. That is secreted, and that is secreted by the epithelial tissue, lining epithelium of the respiratory tract. Then we have the filtering function of epithelium. Epithelium of Bowman's capsule in nephrons filters blood. If you take the excretory system, in the excretory system there are kidneys, and within the kidney there are structures called the nephrons. These are the functional units of the kidney, and within those functional units urine is produced, and during that process there is a filtration which is known as ultrafiltration. We will discuss this in more detail later. For now, you can remember that this filtration is done in an organ or a part of the nephron called the Bowman's capsule. And the lining of the Bowman's capsule is epithelial tissue. And there, the function of the epithelial tissue is filtering. So you can see, students, epithelial tissue lines up the internal and external free surfaces of different organs as well as the organism. And because of that, it can perform many different functions. So that is the epithelial tissue. Now we will move on to the next type of tissues, that is the connective tissue. Connective tissue. Connective tissue is composed of different types of cells and fibers. This is one main feature. Connective tissue has cells and fibers. Now we will look at this diagram. Here you can see many different types of connective tissues are shown to you. Connective tissue under the skin. So that's below the skin there is tissue. Then we have the bones, cartilage and blood. All these are different types of connective tissues. Here you can see the cells. These are the cells and the fibers. Even in these you can see cells and fibers. In the cartilage also you can see the cells and fibers, especially the blood tissue which you are familiar with. That also contains many different types of cells and also fibers. So one feature is that connective tissue is composed of different types of cells and fibers. And these cells and fibers, here you can see, they are all present in a substance called the matrix. That is important. These cells and fibers are embedded in a matrix. That is a large matrix. That is the part that fills up the space that is there in between the cells as well as the fibers. Most connective tissues possess nerve and blood supply. This is different from the epithelial tissue. Connective tissue possesses both nerve and blood supply. The connective tissues provide connection between tissues and organs. That is the main function of connective tissues, and provide support too. Now, if we take the bones, they connect different parts of our body and help us in movement. Whereas if we look at the blood tissue, that connects the different parts by transporting and distributing different types of materials throughout the body. So either way, they do a connecting function. So they provide connection between tissues and organs and provide support. The bones and the cartilages that give a shape to our body and they provide support. So those are the main features of connective tissue. And if we look at the main types of examples for connective tissue, one is the bones, that is a solid type connective tissue, and the other one is blood, which is a liquid type connective tissue. So both are connective tissues. So examples are bones and blood. So these are different features of connective tissue. Now we will look at the blood tissue. Blood tissue. We say that blood is a special connective tissue. I will explain why. Now all the connective tissues have a matrix and also they have many cells and fibers. Here also the blood has a matrix, and this matrix is a liquid matrix that is called the plasma. This is a special feature, and this plasma is not secreted by the blood cells. So here you can see the speciality is that the matrix, that is the plasma, is not secreted by the blood cells. Blood tissue helps in maintaining proper connection between organs and tissue of the human body. So as I explained before, there are different types of cells. You already know that. And these cells have different functions. Out of those, if you look at this cell, that is the RBC, you can identify the red blood cells, RBC. They transport oxygen throughout the body. So they provide proper connection between organs and tissues of the human body. And there are other types of cells as well as fibers. Fibers are not there all the time, but when there is a wound and the wound is healing, there will be fibers produced in the matrix of blood. Let us look at the features of blood tissue. Blood is composed of a fluid matrix that we have already discussed. And the matrix contains cells. Under cells, we look at two main different types of cells. One is the red blood cell, that is termed as RBC, and the white blood cell, WBC. Red blood cells are shown here. They transport oxygen, and white blood cells are involved in phagocytosis, that is the destroying of pathogens, disease-causing microorganisms that enter into the body are destroyed by these WBC, white blood cells. And there are different types of white blood cells which we will discuss later. Then there are these cellular fragments, the platelets. These are very important when there is a wound. Normally, when there is a wound, blood is lost. To prevent blood loss and to heal the wound, initially a clot is formed. And the fibers needed for the clotting process and the substances needed for the clotting processes are all contained within the cellular fragments, platelets. Then we have the fibers. Fibers, as I said before, are not always present, but they appear when there is a wound healing or when there is blood clotting. So, fibers are not found always, but during blood clotting they appear. So, these are the features of blood tissue. And as you know, the blood is contained within the blood vessels of the blood circulatory system. So, students, we can observe different types of cells that are present in blood tissue. Let us observe this in the lab now. Now we are going to observe the blood tissue. You all know it is a type of connective tissue and we will be observing it using the permanent slides available to us. So, I will select the tissue, the permanent slide. Okay, I have the permanent slide smear here. Okay. So, I will place it on the stage and here the light is also on. So, there is enough light falling on the sample specimen and I will move the slide so that the specimen is in the correct position. Now, I can adjust it to the low power and we can observe the specimen. So, when I do a little bit of adjustment, you can see the blood tissue clearly. You can see the different types of cells present in it. This is under low power, students. So, you can observe the different types of cells to a certain extent. To observe it more clearly, I will have to change it to the high power. So, now I will adjust the lens to the high power lens. a little more higher. So now you will be able to see the cells more clearly. Can you all observe that there are different types of cells present in this blood tissue? Okay, students. So you have observed there are different types of cells present in the blood tissue. With that, we will move on to the functions of the blood tissue. Functions of blood tissue. So one function is transportation of materials. We discuss one material, that is oxygen, that is transported by the red blood cells RBC. In addition to that, carbon dioxide produced within the cells is brought back to the respiratory system where carbon dioxide is removed and oxygen is obtained. So there carbon dioxide is also transported by blood. Then the nutrients, vitamins, minerals, the medicines that we take, all these substances are transported by blood. So transportation of materials. Nutrients, those are the vitamins and minerals, respiratory gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, and also excretory materials like ammonia, urea, uric acid, all these are transported by blood. And hormones. We have discussed a few examples of hormones like the thyroxine, estrogen, insulin. These are different types of hormones and they are all transported by blood to the relevant organs. The next function is protection. As I discussed before, white blood cells, that is WBC, destroy foreign bodies, that is microbes, by the process of phagocytosis and by producing antibodies. So WBC destroys the microbes by two methods. One is phagocytosis. When we say phagocytosis, WBC, that is the white blood cell, engulfs and destroys the pathogen. That process is known as phagocytosis. Engulf means just surround the microbe, contain it within the cell and destroy it. Whereas the second method is by producing antibodies. That is a chemical substance that is produced against the microbe that has entered the body. Then we have maintenance of homeostasis. As you already know, students, we are all warm-blooded animals. So here we are warm-blooded animals. What is the meaning of warm-blooded animals? The temperature of our body has to be maintained irrespective of the changes in the environment temperature. Similarly, there are many other substances like water, the amount of glucose, amount of salts, all these have to be maintained at a certain level. There is a range. It shouldn't be too much or too less. So the process of maintaining the balance in the internal environment of our body is known as homeostasis. And blood is one of the main tissues that involve in homeostasis. So when we say warm-blooded animals, it is the temperature. Same way, amount of water in the body. Then we have the level of glucose. These are some of the things that need to be maintained during the process of homeostasis. Balance of water, balance of glucose, and maintaining the temperature. So students, those are the functions of blood tissue. With that, we have finished the discussion on connective tissues. Now we will move on to the next type of tissue, that is the muscle tissues. Muscle tissues. So when we talk about muscle tissues, you all know there are muscles in different parts of your body. If you take your hand, there are muscle tissues. There are muscles in your face. So when you walk, you need to use the muscle tissue. When you move your hands, you use the muscle tissues. And even while I am talking, I am using the muscle tissues. So if we look at what muscle tissues are, muscle tissue is one of the main tissues that makes up the human body. Muscle tissue is made up of muscle cells or muscle fibers. So these tissues are made up of either muscle cells or fibers. Cells have a certain shape. You will see there is a cell that has a spindle shape. When we say fibers, they are long cylindrical structures. So the muscle tissue can be made up of either a muscle cell or a muscle fiber. These muscle fibers possess contraction and relaxation ability. Now let's say I am stretching and bending my hands. You all know that there are two main types of muscles in the hands. That is bicep and tricep muscles. When you need to stretch your hand, one muscle, that is the bicep muscle, has to contract and the tricep muscle has to relax. And when you bend your hand, it will happen the other way around. Bicep muscles will relax and the tricep muscle will contract. So here the muscles have the ability to contract and relax. They can either become short and get back to their normal length. So that is the ability to contract and relax. By doing that, they help in movement of the human body and parts of the body. The muscle tissues possess a good blood supply. Now these are muscles or tissues that help in movement. So to move our hand or to move from one place to the other, we need to spend a lot of energy. For that to happen, there should be lot of cellular respiration producing or releasing energy. So for cellular respiration to take place, the muscles need to have glucose as well as oxygen. So that is provided by the good blood supply. Therefore, muscle tissue receives oxygen and nutrients at a high rate. So here you can see they receive oxygen and nutrients at a high rate. So they can function easily. And the muscle tissue acts as one of the effectors in responding in coordination. So effectors, when we say coordination, when you touch a hot object, you draw your hand away. That whole process together is coordination. There are so many other coordination processes we will learn later. But here, in this example, to move the hand away, the muscle tissues act as one of the effectors. Drawing the hand away is the effect shown to the stimuli. So, response given to the stimuli. The other response is shown by muscle tissue. So, they are effectors in responding in coordination. Muscle tissue is of three types. Based on where you get the muscle tissue and their function and their characteristics, there are 3 types of muscle tissues. One is the smooth muscle. The other one, skeletal muscle. And we have the cardiac muscles. So we have the smooth muscle, skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. They differ in their structure as well as their function. Now we will look at the first type of muscle, the smooth muscle. Smooth muscle tissue. Smooth muscle tissue is made up of smooth muscle cells. So as we discussed before, the muscles can be either made up of cells or fibers. So here they are made up of smooth muscle cells. This tissue is found in the walls of organs with cavities. So here you have to remember these students, walls of organs with cavities. So if you take the reproductive system of females, the part where the fetus grows or the fetus develops is the uterus. This is a muscular structure where there is a cavity for the development of the fetus. And this is made up of smooth muscle tissue. So an example is the uterus of the reproductive system. Then we have the digestive tract. In different parts of the digestive tract, there are smooth muscles, especially the intestine and the stomach. So these contain muscles, that is smooth muscles, that are needed for the digestion process. So here we can say parts of the digestive tract. Parts of the digestive tract. Then the urinary bladder. We discussed before, urinary bladder stores urine temporarily, and this has smooth muscle in its wall. So the wall of the urinary bladder. Wall of the urinary bladder. Then we have the blood vessels. We said the capillaries are made up of epithelial tissue only. But the other blood vessels, which are larger, have the epithelial lining as well as a smooth muscle wall. So walls of blood vessels are made up of smooth muscles. Wall of blood vessels. Are made up of smooth muscles. So as you can see here, all these, the uterus, the digestive tract, the urinary bladder and the blood vessel, they all have cavities. Organs with cavities have smooth muscle tissue in them. Now that you have understood this smooth muscle, we will discuss the features of smooth muscles. Features of smooth muscle cell. So they are made up of cells. You can see the smooth muscle cells shown in this diagram. can you all see the shape of this cell? It's broad in the middle and it gets pointed towards the end. We call it the tapering end. And that shape is called spindle shape. So the cells of the smooth muscles, so I will say cells, first one are spindle shaped. Then you can see there is no branch for the cell. They are all single cells. So there is no branching. The next one you can see in all the cells. In the center there is a nucleus. So all these spindle shaped cells possess one nucleus. We call it uninucleate. So here cells possess one nucleus. That is called uninucleate. Then you can see the outer layer of the cell, that is the plasma membrane. You are familiar with the structure of animal cells. They are surrounded by the plasma membrane. So these are some of the features that you can see here. And there is a reason why we call these cells as, or the tissue as, smooth muscle tissue or smooth muscle cell. There are no striations. When we discuss the other two types of tissues, you will see that there are cross lines across the muscle fiber. But that is absent in these smooth muscle cells. So that means there are no striations. So that is another feature of the smooth muscle cell. No striations. And also, when you eat, your digestive system functions continuously until the food is digested. And during this process, the smooth muscles don't get tired easily. That means we say that the smooth muscles do not become fatigued easily. Fatigue means they don't get tired very quickly. They don't get stiff or tired. So another feature is that smooth muscles don't get fatigue easily. Another feature, these muscles function without our control. That means we don't have to think that the food has to be digested. It happens automatically. So that process is known as involuntarily controlled. So the smooth muscles are involuntarily controlled. We don't have to think and do. But to move a hand or to talk, you have to think and do. That is a voluntarily controlled action. Smooth muscles are involuntarily controlled muscles. So here they are involuntarily controlled. So those are the features of the smooth muscle cell. Here you can see these are features that are seen or observed in the structure of the smooth muscle cell. but these two are related to their function. So these are structural features and the last two are functional features. Now that you have understood the features of the smooth muscle tissue, let us observe this smooth muscle in the lab. There are permanent slides available. We will observe such a slide under the light microscope. Now we will observe the first type of muscle tissues, that is smooth muscle. So for that I'll be using a permanent slide that is there in the lab. I will get the smooth muscle tissue. Okay. I can observe the features of the smooth muscle using this permanent slide. I will change the lens to the low power. Now we can observe the smooth muscles through this. Okay. Now when I adjust the coarse adjustment, students, you can see the shape of the cell clearly to a certain extent. You can see the shape of the smooth muscle. You can clearly see the spindle shape and the nucleus in the center. So here you can observe all the features of the smooth muscle tissue. Okay, students. So you have observed the smooth muscle tissues under the light microscope. You would have been able to identify these features. Now let us move on to the next type of muscle tissue, that is the skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue is made up of skeletal muscle fibers. So always muscle tissues are either made up of cells or fibers. So skeletal muscles are made up of fibers. These are mostly associated with the skeletal system. That is why we call them as skeletal muscles. The skeletal system is the bones. So these muscles are attached to the bones or associated with the bones, so that they mainly involve in movement of different parts of the body as well as in locomotion of the body. That is the organism itself moving from one place to the other. The skeletal muscles help in locomotion and movements of chordates. So these are why the body has skeletal muscle. If we look at different examples, the bicep muscles of the hand and the tricep muscle of the hand are very good examples of skeletal muscle tissue. So here examples are bicep muscles and the tricep muscles of the hands. So bicep and tricep muscles of the hands. I said the muscles in legs, that is also another example. Muscles of the leg, and also when we show expressions, when we are talking, we are doing movement. The movement is shown by the facial muscles. So that is also a type of skeletal muscle. Facial muscle. Okay, students, you have understood why we have skeletal muscles in our body. With that understanding, we will look at the features of skeletal muscles. Features of skeletal muscle fibers. Here you can look at this picture. You can see they are made up of muscle fibers, not cells, because these are very long cylindrical structures. And there is no branching. The muscle fibers are all straight, they are not branched. So that is the first feature of muscle fibers. Cylindrical, unbranched, and long fibers. Then you can see that there are many lines which are going across the fibers. Those lines are known as cross striations. So there are striations present in these skeletal muscle fibers. So there are striations present. Then you can see in each muscle fiber, if you look at the second muscle fiber, there are more than one nucleus. So this muscle fiber contains many nuclei, or we call it multinucleate. So this is multinucleate. And also here you can see the muscle fibers are surrounded by plasma membrane. Surrounded by plasma membrane. We discussed that these muscles are present in different organs where there is lot of movement involved. So if it has to move, the muscles need lot of energy. That is why we said there is lot of blood supply. Enough oxygen and nutrients are supplied to the skeletal muscle. And if there is enough oxygen and nutrients, that is the glucose, what process has to take place? Yes, the cellular respiration has to take place. And what is the organelle in which cellular respiration takes place? The mitochondria. So these skeletal muscle fibers contain lot of mitochondria so that there can be enough energy produced. So here they contain a large number of mitochondria. Now these muscles are attached or associated to the skeletal system, and they involve in both locomotion and movement. And this is done with our will. That is, we think and do these functions. That means these muscles are controlled voluntarily. The muscles are controlled voluntarily. And because of this movement and locomotion, when you keep on doing the function over a long period of time, the muscles become tired. So they become fatigued easily. Muscles become fatigued easily. So as you can see, students, the properties or features that are given above are structural features. Cylindrical, unbranched, long fibers. Striations are present, multinucleate, they are surrounded by plasma membrane and they contain a large number of mitochondria. Whereas the voluntarily controlled feature and the muscles becoming fatigued are associated with their function. We will try to identify the features of skeletal muscle by observing the permanent slide under light microscope. Now we are going to observe the skeletal muscle tissue. So here I have a set of permanent slides. From that we can observe how the skeletal muscle tissues and the cells will look like under the light microscope. So I will select the skeletal muscle tissue from this one. I have the slide here. This is a permanent slide that has been prepared for skeletal muscle tissue. Right. Now I have the slide placed on the stage and I will make sure that the specimen is in place. Okay, now it's set and as you can see there is enough light falling on the stage, so the specimen will be clear to me. First I will observe it through the low power. So the lens is the low power lens. Now if we can observe, under this you can see the muscle fibers and the muscle tissue clearly. So in that you can have a look at the overall features of the striated or skeletal muscle tissue. Okay students, so you have observed all the features of skeletal muscle. So that is the discussion on skeletal muscles. Now we will move on to the third type of muscle tissue, that is the cardiac muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle tissue. So from the name you can easily remember cardiac means it's related to the heart. So the walls of the heart are made up of cardiac muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle tissue is made up of cardiac muscle cells and these are the cardiac muscle cells. So and it is exclusively found in the vertebrate heart. So that is why I have shown it in the diagram. These are the cardiac muscle cells and they are found only in the vertebrate heart. So with that we will discuss the features of cardiac muscles. Features of cardiac muscle fibers. So here you can see students a diagram of a cardiac muscle tissue and these are again made up of fibers. You can see the fibers are cylindrical in nature and also they have branches. Unlike the striated muscles, the cardiac muscles are branched. So the first feature, cylindrical branched. And if you look at these fibers, you can see there is only one nucleus within these markings. If we take a full fiber, there are those markings. These are called the intercalated disc. So intercalated discs are present between cardiac muscle cells and that marks one cell of cardiac muscle. And in each cell you can see there is only one nucleus. So we can say these have intercalated disc present, and because they only have one nucleus, we call it uninucleate. So I have said these are cylindrical fibers, they are branched, and the fibers are divided by the intercalated disc present in them, and in each cell there is only one nucleus. And also you can see that there are cross striations present. So that is the next feature, cross striations are present. And we saw that these cardiac muscle fibers are exclusively present in the heart muscles of vertebrates. So when these heart functions, they have to contract and relax rhythmically. So therefore, the cardiac muscle fibers also contract rhythmically. So that is a functional feature of the cardiac muscle. Contract rhythmically. And also you all know, we don't think of the heart beating. So that means it happens without our knowledge. So that means the cardiac muscle is involuntarily controlled. So involuntarily controlled. Controlled. And also, usually the cardiac muscle never gets tired. It never becomes fatigue. If it does, then there is a problem with the heart. We usually call it the cardiac arrest. So normally in a healthy person, the cardiac muscle never becomes fatigued. Never becomes fatty. So students, these are the features of cardiac muscle fibers. So here you can see, although they are fibers, they are divided into cells, and these are the structural features. And the last three, contract rhythmically, involuntary control, and never become fatigued, are functional features. Now that you have understood the features of cardiac muscles, we will observe a permanent slide of cardiac muscles. Now as I said, we are going to observe a permanent slide of the cardiac muscle tissue. So I will select the slide from the box of slides, the cardiac tissue. Okay, I have it here, so I can place it on the stage, but before that I have to check whether the light is on. Yes, and I'll put it to the low power first. Okay, and also I'll make sure that this specimen is exactly in the correct position so that we can observe it clearly. Okay, now that it's all set and there is enough light falling on the specimen, I can observe it through the low power. So now when I observe it through the low power and I do a little bit of adjustment, Yes, students. Now you all can see the cells of the cardiac muscle clearly. How the cells are, the shape of the cells and the color. Here it is a dyed permanent slide, so you can see it clearly. You can see all the features of the cardiac muscle. Now that is not sufficient. So what I will do is I will change it to the high power. So when we change to the high power, and I'll do a little bit of adjustment. Let me adjust it a little bit. Okay. Now you can see the cells even more clearly. All the features of the cardiac muscles, not all of them, but the features of the cardiac muscle tissue can be seen in this slide. So students, you have observed how the cells look like in a cardiac muscle tissue. So with that, we finish the discussion on cardiac muscle tissue. I am sure students, now you understand the 3 different types of muscle tissues and you should be able to differentiate the features. Compare as well as differentiate the features. We will do that next. The type of muscle is given to you and there are some features given. You should be able to identify similarities as well as differentiate between the 3 muscles. So, shape of muscle cell or fiber. The smooth muscle has a spindle shape. And these are muscle cells. Whereas the skeletal muscles are cylindrical in shape. As well as the cardiac muscles are also cylindrical in shape. And the next one is branching. There is no branching in smooth muscle because they are cells. But the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscles are cylindrical fibers. So here I will include that word as well. Cylindrical fiber, here also cylindrical fiber. But in skeletal muscle, there is no branching. Here there is branching. Then if we look at the number of nuclei, smooth muscle is uninucleate. Skeletal muscle, you all know, is multinucleate. Again, cardiac muscle is uninucleate. Striations. If we look at the striations, it's absent. But in both skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, striations are present. If we look at the nerve control, smooth muscle is involuntary. Skeletal muscle with our control. So that means voluntary. Again, cardiac muscle, involuntary. And the last function or the functional feature become fatigue. Smooth muscle, very rarely. Whereas skeletal muscle, easily. And the cardiac muscle never becomes fatigue. So now you can see similarities and differences. Shape, skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle are cylindrical, but skeletal muscle is unbranched, cardiac muscle is branched. Smooth muscle is spindle shaped. Nucleus, Smooth and cardiac are similar. Skeletal is different. Striations again, skeletal and cardiac both have striations. Nerve control, smooth muscle and the cardiac muscle tissue are involuntarily controlled. And becoming fatigued depends on the function. Skeletal muscles can become fatigued easily, whereas cardiac muscle never becomes fatigued easily. So with that, I will finish the discussion on muscle tissues. So now we will move on to the fourth main type of tissue, the nerve tissue or nervous tissue. Nervous tissue. It is an important tissue found in chordate's body. So you have to remember this. Chordates are a type of animals. Vertebrates also belong to the type chordates. So here this is the fourth type of tissue present in animal body. And the structural unit of nervous tissue is known as the nerve cell or neuron. You have to remember, students, structural unit is called the nerve cell or neuron. This is a special name given to the structural unit. So all nervous tissues are made up of neurons. And we will discuss a little later that there are 3 different types of neurons present, depending on their structure as well as their function. Neurons are specialized to transmit impulses. So the function of the nervous tissue itself is to involve in coordination by transmitting nerve impulses. So the neurons are specialized to transmit impulses. That is their function. Given here is a diagram of a neuron. And as I told you all, this is called a motor neuron. We will look at the classification a little later. And now I will explain the different parts of this neuron. All the neurons are made up of 2 main parts, the cell body and the nerve fiber. So here you can see this structure is the cell body. The cell body contains a nucleus. So here I will write this as the cell body and this part is the nucleus. You can see from the cell body different nerve fibers generate. And in this, the short fibers which are branched are called the dendrons. So I will have to mark the dendron here. These are known as dendrons. And the endings, the branches end at these points and the endings of the dendron are known as dendrites. So these are the dendrites. And you can see here the longer nerve fiber is called the axon. And this is formed as one process. So here inside you can see this brown color nerve fiber, that is the axon. So here this is the axon. And the axon also branches out at the end and the branches end at the synapses vesicle. So here we have the synapses vesicles. This is a special property. Here you can see these 2 parts, a special feature seen in only this type of neuron. I told you all, the motor neuron. This cover is known as the myelin sheath. This is there for the protection of the axon. So here these covers are called the myelin sheath. And this myelin sheath is not continuous. It is a discontinuous cover. And in between, wherever there is a space, that part is called the node of Ranvier. So here you can see this is a node of Ranvier. So students, those are the different parts of a neuron or a nerve cell. If you are given a diagram, you should be able to identify all these parts. Now, I will move on to the features of nervous tissues. Features of neuron. Neuron is composed of two parts. This is what I already explained to you all. They are called cell body and nerve fibers. Nucleus, mitochondria, Golgi body and endoplasmic reticulum are found in the cell body. So like any cell, the cell body of the nerve cell contains all the organelles. Axon arises from the cell body as a single process. So axon is just one single continuous process and the generation is also one single process. Axon transmits impulses away from the cell body. So here, if the impulse is in this part, it will be transmitted in this direction. So here I can say the impulse transfer will happen from the cell body towards that direction because the axon is in that direction. Dendrons branch out to form dendrites. So here, as I showed you all before, these are the dendrons and they branch out and form the dendrites. Dendrites receive stimuli and transmit impulses to the cell body. So dendrites receive stimuli and transmit impulses to the cell body. Told you all, the information or the impulse is brought to the cell body by the dendrons, taken away from the cell body by the axon. Most of the axons in chordates are myelinated. So here, this is something that you have to remember. Axons in chordates are myelinated and that is the myelin sheath. Myelin sheath is not continuous. The interrupted places are known as nodes of Ranvier. The myelin sheath increases the speed of transmission. This is an advantage of the presence of myelin sheath. So now students, you all have a good understanding of the structure of a neuron or the nerve cell, which is the basic unit of the structural unit of the nerve tissue. And also you can see at the end of the axon, where you get the dendrites, you have the synapses vesicles. These synapses vesicles are connected to the effectors, where the information is given to the next effector. So with these students, we have discussed the features of neuron. We will see how nerve cells look like in a permanent tissue. we will observe it under the light microscope. Now you all know what we are going to observe. What type of tissue is this? We are going to observe the nervous tissue. How the cells will look like in a nervous tissue. And you all know the basic unit of nerves is the nerve cell or the neuron. So as we did before, I have the set of permanent slides here. So from that, I will take out the nerve tissue. Okay, so this is a permanent slide prepared with nerve tissue. I will place it on the stage of the microscope. Then I will have to, already the light is on. So I have enough light for the specimen. I will have to adjust the slide so that the specimen is visible to me clearly. Okay, now the specimen is ready. First we will look it through the low power of the microscope. As you can see, already the low power has been selected. So I'll be using the low power to observe this. Now already the stage is down, I will rotate it a little bit so that I can see the cells somewhat clearly. Now you can see, students, under the low power, you can see the different shape of the nerve cells. These are very much different from the cells that we have been observing so far. You can see the shape of the cell body and the nerve fibers all together present in this slide. Okay, students. So from this slide, you were able to observe that the cells of the nerve tissue, what we call as the nerve cell or the neuron, is different from the cells that were present in the other tissues. Now let us look at the different types of neurons based on their structure and functions. Functions of neurons. The function of the neuron is to receive the information from the receptors, eye, ear, nose, tongue and skin, or another neuron, and to transmit them to the effector, muscles, or to another neuron. We discussed an example. When we touch a hot object, the heat is the stimuli, and that is received by the skin because it has receptors. So here you can see receive information from the receptors. So that information is given to the rest of the neurons present and finally to the nervous system. And there the brain or the nervous system says what to do. Remove your hand immediately. So there the response is transmitted back to the effector so that you pull your hand away. This is not a very slow process. It's a very, very fast process. Immediately as you touch the hot object, you draw your hand away. So these nerve impulses are transmitted at a very high speed. So here you can see these are the receptors, and it can be given to another neuron and to transmit them to the effector. So that completes the full process. According to the function of the neuron, they can be divided into three types as follows. The first one is the sensory neuron. Here you can see a sensory neuron. The cell body is in the middle and the dendron and the axon start from the same point of the cell body. And here you can see they are branched. So this is a feature that will help you to identify the sensory neuron. Then we have the interneuron. Interneuron again has short dendrons and the axon is long, but it is branched. And the branches are also somewhat prominent. So this is different from the third type, the motor neuron. So the third type of neuron is motor neuron. Here you can see the motor neuron has short dendrons but a very long axon and also the myelin sheath and the Ranvier's nodes. So these are the three types of neurons, and from their names you can understand their function. Sensory neuron receives the stimuli and transmits it to the central nervous system. So they bring the sense or the stimuli into the nervous system. Interneuron connects the different neurons, and motor neuron takes away information to the effector to do the movement or the give out the effect. When you get a stimuli, when you receive a stimuli, the body has to respond to it. So that response is taken to the effector via the motor neuron. Let us look at these three neurons in a little bit more detail. Extra knowledge. Sensory neuron. The cell body of the sensory neuron is present at the middle of the nerve fibers. You saw that in the diagram. The cell bodies are present inside ganglion. In nerves, there are ganglions and the cell body is present inside the ganglion. The dendrites are present at the sensory organs and the axon is present in the central nervous system. Ganglion is a structure formed by the collection of cell bodies. So many neurons exist together and the cell bodies of all these neurons form the ganglion. They transmit impulse from sensory organs to the central nervous system. They transmit impulse from the sensory organ to the central nervous system. Motor neuron. A motor neuron possesses a star-shaped cell body with many fibers. One of them is the axon and it is long. You were able to observe that as well. Sometimes it is greater than 1 meter in length. The other fibers and cell body are found within the central nervous system. The function of the motor neuron is to transmit impulses from central nervous system to effector, that is the muscles. So this is something that you have to remember. You don't have to go into detail about the different structures and the parts present, but you have to remember their functions clearly. And also, as you see a diagram, you should be able to identify and differentiate the three types of neurons. Interneuron. The whole neuron is present within the central nervous system. The axons are short, many dendrites are present. The interneuron connects the sensory neuron with motor neuron. So here this provides a connection between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. Okay students, with that I come to the end of the discussion on nervous system. I am sure you all have a good understanding about the 4 different types of tissues that are present in a multicellular organism. An example is man. The epithelial tissue, the connective tissue, the 3 types of muscle tissues and the nervous tissue. And because of their structure, they vary in functions. Or in other words, you can say because they need to perform a certain function, they exist in different forms. So, you should know their features and where they are present and also their functions. So, with that, we will move on to the summary. So, here we have already discussed the plant tissues. A diagrammatic representation of the classification of plant tissues is given. Initially, we divide it into 2 main groups. The meristematic tissue that divides continuously. Permanent tissue, tissue that contains differentiated cells which do not divide all the time, or the cells that have lost their ability to divide are permanent tissues. Under meristematic tissue, depending on the position of the meristem, there are 3 types. The apical meristem, lateral meristem and intercalary meristem. Permanent tissue is divided into 2 groups based on the number of different cells present. If there are only 1 type of cells, they are called simple permanent tissues, and more than 2 types of cells, complex permanent tissues. And there are 3 types of simple permanent tissue: parenchyma, collenchyma and sclerenchyma. The complex permanent tissues are xylem and phloem. They are the vascular tissues. They mainly involve in transport of substances. Xylem transports water and phloem translocates food. A group of cells with a common origin adapted to perform a particular function in living body is known as a tissue. This is the definition for tissue. You have to remember this explanation. The next part, chordate body is composed of 4 main tissues such as epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue and nervous tissue. Epithelial tissues lines up the free surfaces of chordates and performs absorption, secretion, filtration, perception of senses and protection. Many different functions. The connective tissue is made up of different types of cells, fibers and a large matrix. The special feature of connective tissue. It connects the organs and tissues together and provides support to them. Smooth muscles, skeletal muscles and cardiac muscles are present in the human body. The contraction and relaxation of those help in different movements in the body. Transmission of impulses is carried out by the nervous system. There are 3 types of neurons. So, you know nervous system is involved with transmission of impulses. Stimulus is received and a response is given. And this transmission is done by neurons. And based on their structure and functions, there are 3 types. They are sensory neurons, motor neurons and interneurons. So, students, with this, I have come to the end of discussion on living tissues. We discussed the 2 main types of tissues, the plant tissues and the animal tissues. And I am sure now you have got a good understanding about what tissues are and how we classify them, and also their features, the presence in a human body as well as in a plant body and also their functions. But as I always say, just listening to the discussion once will not be enough. You will have to read the textbook again and again listen to the discussion, and also you should practice answering questions so that you will be competent to answer any type of question given in your paper. So to do that, we will move on to the exercise given in your textbook first.